Welcome to the Teaching Commons online tutorials on course design. We have created a series of short videos that cover the elements of course design to guide you through the process of developing a course. In this video, I will be demonstrating the process of alignment, which is central to developing a good course. Alignment is a principle in curriculum theory that emphasizes the need for your content to be weaved into a common thread that unites learning outcomes, teaching activities, and assessment tasks to create the optimal environment for student learning. By the end of this tutorial, you will be able to see that course design informs teaching decisions and that classroom practices have an impact on course design as well. You will have an opportunity to identify the elements to consider in designing or redesigning a course, and reflect on the relevance and applicability of adopting a reasoned approach to course development for your own teaching context. The model we have chosen to help us conceptualize the course design process is adapted from McGill University. As you can see from the visual, the process of aligning teaching and learning activities, feedback and assessment to the learning outcomes is iterative. One may start anywhere in the course design process, as long as all elements are ultimately integrated into one seamless thread. The course that I will be using as an example for the course design process is entitled Linguistics Applied to French. It is a course that I offered a number of times at the beginning of my university teaching career to third and fourth year undergraduate students specializing in French literature and linguistics. The language of instruction was French. The course provided an overview of the linguistic structures of the French language and concepts from general linguistics. It also examined the differences between French varieties. One of my goals was to help students find the linguistic patterns of European and Canadian French. This carried the unspoken expectation that students would develop the view that a language is in fact a collection of varieties that are socially unequal but linguistically neutral. I will return to this unspoken expectation and its implication for course design a bit later. Students were also required to collect their own sample of spoken or written French and apply them to phenomenon described in class. In designing this course, I followed the four-stage design process described by Biggs and Tang. Although they recommend drafting learning outcomes first, I initiated the design of the course as many professors do. Instead of having well-defined learning outcomes, I had a set of generic learning objectives that I used to create, albeit somewhat intuitively, a learning environment based on the content that I wanted to cover. Then I defined the assessment tasks and developed the marking rubrics to help me judge the performance of my students. It is only upon reflecting on my course after teaching it once or twice that I begin articulating the learning outcomes. The reason for this is simply that until I was able to teach the course once, I was not too clear on how to write effective learning outcomes. It goes to show that the course design process is always in flux. I will start by presenting the learning outcomes for the course that I want to showcase in order to emphasize the common thread between those outcomes, my classroom activities, and assignments. So an effective learning outcome is formulated with an active verb, for example, summarize or analyze, so that it describes in specific terms how students are to demonstrate their learning of the content. An active verb also helps making the outcome more measurable. When defining learning outcomes, it is useful to use Bloom's taxonomy so that student learning can be defined in terms of observable behavior organized along a hierarchy of thinking processes. The key question is, what does a student need to do to demonstrate his or her understanding? Answering this question with a concrete verb, such as the ones that are in this table, will help me define what I mean by understanding a concept or a theory. And Bloom's taxonomy allows me to think about the level of abstraction that I wish my students to reach for each of the learning outcomes. The complexity of thinking processes increases from low to high levels of thinking when I ask students to, on the one hand, recall information, apply concepts, which would be at the mid-level, or design a study. The learning outcomes for the course that I want to showcase are listed in the next 2 slides. If you would like more time to read the learning outcomes for the course, simply pause the video and resume when you're done reading. You'll notice that I used active verbs for each of the learning outcomes so that the kind of understanding that I was expecting from my students was clearly communicated to them. Even if my course were surveying an entire field and was therefore content heavy, I expected my students to do more than just recall information. My first task was to map out my course by matching the learning outcomes I had drafted according to Bloom's taxonomy, as you can see here in this table. It is only a partial table, and the full list of our outcomes and how it maps out with Bloom's taxonomy is available in one of the handouts provided under the video screen. This exercise helped me realize that some of my learning outcomes were setting low expectations, whereas my goal was to target mid and high levels of understanding. I had some at the low level. As a result, I changed, for example, the first learning outcomes slightly from describe to compare and contrast. In other words, from a low to a mid level of understanding. While this change may seem of little significance, it actually made a big difference later on when I designed my activities and assessment tasks. Once I was satisfied with my learning outcomes, I moved on to designing different blocks of learning. The one that I describe here relates to sound. On this slide, I have the complete course organizer for this learning block, and it is also available as a handout below the video screen. Should be more readable. Here's a partial view of my course organizer. After I laid out the general learning outcomes, I generated more specific ones addressing my learning block. So for example, up until that point, students had to learn to represent sound in the abstract. As they learned about the vowel system in European and Canadian French and heard language samples, they started to practice transcribing vowels, not only as theoretical constructs, but as they were actually pronounced. The teaching and learning activities related to this outcome, as well as the portfolio assignment, are listed in the last 2 columns here. Next, I mapped out activities and assessment tasks against Bloom's taxonomy to ensure alignment between my learning outcomes and what I was doing in class, as well as how I was assessing students. With most of my activities at the mid-level of Bloom's taxonomy, I felt that I was providing students with an appropriate environment for learning to foster the learning outcomes. But I do want to draw your attention to the question mark next to learning outcome 5, both in my activities and also in my assessment. Please note that sample assessments, including the portfolio assignment and its associated rubric, are provided as handouts under the video screen. So what have I learned from this process? The first lesson that I learned was that going through the process step by step helped me clarify for myself and then communicate more clearly to my students what were my learning goals for them, and more specifically the outcomes, or, if you will, how I wanted to be able to observe their learning. As Kennedy, Hinlan, and Ryan point out, having clear expectations is an important part of effective teaching and learning. I also discovered some internal inconsistencies between my plan and what I actually did in the classroom. For one thing, the learning block on sounds took too much class time compared to its relative importance to other topics. That's in part because I enjoy this part of the course. I also had a somewhat lower level focus than what I really intended for my students, because my goal was really for them to apply the knowledge that they were gaining in my course. Last, it became clear to me that I was not properly emphasizing some of the learning outcomes that I had drafted for this course. In other words, it might have been a goal of mine, but it wasn't really emphasized in the teaching and learning activities. Upon reflection, I realized that these outcomes were important to me, but perhaps did not belong to a survey course in linguistics. Based on this experience, I redeveloped my learning outcomes by drawing more from the top end of Bloom's taxonomy. This is what I showed earlier when I went from describe to compare and contrast. This in turn really forced me to revise my teaching and learning activities. As Saroyan and Amundsen point out, we need to ask ourselves, what are the kinds of instructional activities needed to achieve higher order learning outcomes? In my view, this is really what a university education is about. So for me, starting class with a conventional lecture was no longer the answer. I decided to flip my course. The term flipped classroom refers to content delivered with web-based technology. More specifically, students engage with the learning materials at home and at their own speed, and this frees up time for curated discussion as well as collaborative learning in the classroom. So instead of coming to class to listen to a long lecture, my students stepped in my class prepared to engage in application activities, followed by clarification lectures if and when needed. My course is still not perfect, but the process of mapping it out really helped me achieve good alignment between all of the course components to create a richer learning environment. Now that I have applied the process of course design to a real course, I hope that it can help you pull together some of the important concepts of course design and apply them to your own teaching context. If you'd like, I invite you to brainstorm about key concepts that struck you as essential to create your own course design organizer. You'll find underneath the video screen some resources and handouts to help you get started on your course design. Well, I hope you have fun, and if you have any questions along the way, feel free to book a consultation with one of us educational developers at the Teaching Commons. We'll be happy to help.